So guys, I just got done watching Superman and Lois Season 3, Episode 9, and this isn't a negative reaction, by the way. I always have to take a sip of coffee to make things dramatic here, but no, really, that ending to the episode that I literally just saw, man, it just... This episode in particular, I feel, was a very Lois and Clark-oriented one. A bit of a somewhat love letter, if you will. Now, I know we delved more into, of course, what Lois is dealing with the cancer, but as the plot unfolded in a very Lois and Clark-centric episode, if you will, I mean, a lot of other things happened. It just somewhat culminated in this very rich representation of the Lois and Clark relationship. And again, I always have to say this, agree with me or disagree with me, but Tyler Hoechlin and Elizabeth Tulloch just resounded what makes those characters, Lois and Clark. And this show, again, it's all about Superman and Lois, many years into the future. They have kids, they're teenagers. So I just feel like this show just, I'm going to be repeating myself and gushing again and again. It really does do it so well. I know there's lots of comments out there saying, oh, while they enjoy this story, it is very heavy hitting, if you will. I personally enjoy that. I like how we see the representation of kind of what that's like with regards to Lois going through that, how it can affect Superman. Like, this is a super family, but it doesn't make you super invulnerable to things like this. But I do feel like they've done a very quality job. And this episode, again, I feel like the people who aren't enjoying the storyline with what Lois is dealing with may not really have enjoyed some of the more heavy-hitting things we got into in this episode. But for me, I'm really liking it. The beginning of the episode picks up with a 17 years ago flashback at the Daily Planet. We have Lois and Clark talking about booking venues for their wedding, which comes very full circle at the end, of course, with Lois choosing the Kent farm. But a big part of this, and what I loved about these flashbacks, is, they're 17 years ago. Lois and Clark aren't married yet. They're getting married sooner or later, but we see Lois get nominated for a journalistic excellence thing for the piece she wrote on Henry Miller, none other than Henry Miller, who also featured in this episode, and it's more or less the highest honor for journalism that you can get. Now, these flashbacks continue. We'll talk about them, I guess, when they pop up, but this is when we flash forward to present day with Lois and Clark going to the doctor, and the doctor has good news, and the scans are looking good. She has one more round of chemo, but of course, a big impact of the story in this episode for Lois is that after that last round of chemo, they feel good enough to go through the surgery, which is a double mastectomy, to hopefully after that, maybe it will be thumbs up with regards to Lois and maybe the cancer being gone. Obviously, as the doctor said, more scans need to happen, but I like how they explored it this episode, because as Lois said herself, she knew about the double mastectomy being a thing since day one, but in this episode, as she's had that doctor's meeting, it's all she can think about. And again, it's something very real, something that I feel the episode represented with regards to Lois's outlook on it, her mental state, insecurities she's having and experiencing that she talks about with Lana a little bit later on. I know some people feel like this is a bit too heavy, and I get it. Like, I think it's done very, very well, and I'm very engrossed in it. I think it's like a really interesting situation to put into the Superman and Lois story, but some other people, I feel, maybe aren't enjoying this as much because it hits maybe a bit too hard. I'm not really sure. I've seen lots of different comments. I think mostly people are like really on board, but I've seen some people, I don't really know how to put it, maybe get put off by this a little bit. But my overall thoughts on it is that Superman and Lois is somewhat of a family show where we're exploring a period of Superman's life and Lois's life when they have kids, when they're much older, to be fair, probably older than what they look in the show, especially when you get into flashbacks and whatnot. So with all the things that this show does, like exploring the marriage, the fact of having two teenage boys, all of the other things we've got into, whether you want to put the Cushings in it and a divorce there, it's always been that kind of show. So this storyline popping up in it, even though, of course, Superman is a superhero and we get things like that, this show always does tackle, in the family aspect of it, reflections of reality that couples, kids, teenagers, other people, friends, family get into. But without getting into that too much, let me know what you think down in the comments. I think it's great personally, but I do understand if some people are like, oh man, This is like really, really, really deep. But anyway, moving on, we have Jordan not wanting Jonathan to tell, obviously, Lois and Clark about Kyle catching on to a freaking superhero in the town. That plot's been kind of benched for this episode. Up next, we have John Henry and Natalie go to Lana. Obviously, these two are slowly cooking along. They for sure show it in these moments with Lana reassuring John Henry in this moment, like getting very close to him and basically, looking into each other's eyes for like 5 seconds straight with dead silence, and it's like, okay, they had a little moment there. But meanwhile with Natalie, she's been given like a freaking Nightwing Eskrima stick. She has a tracker on her bracelet because John Henry, as what they're clearly showing here, is getting very, very involved with the Bruno Manheim threat. And I like how multifaceted they make it, because you have like Superman disapproving 1 minute, but we also have a chance to lean into John Henry's perspective. And I have to say, like, I can't necessarily blame him half the time, especially with the issue they bring up with Henry Miller at the very end of the episode, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But this is when we hear that Manheim wants to talk, so this is when we're transported to the DOD, and Superman, John Henry, Sam Lane are there. The whole gist of this is, as we know, Bruno Manheim wants to see his wife. She's literally dying. She has a couple of weeks to maybe even days to live, and the fact that John Henry is denying him access and Mateo access to see her is infuriating him. I think anyone would feel that way, but the whole gist is, hey, if you just give us the XK back, the Bizarro corpse, obviously Superman's blood, you can see her. So, like, how much does this mean to you? Do you really want to see your wife? Like, how much would you be willing to give up? Would you give up these things we're asking for if you really want to see her? But Bruno Manheim doesn't want to do that. And obviously, they don't know exactly what he's up to. And the reason why he's not necessarily doing that right now is because he is so close to a cure. So he's wanting to have the best of both worlds here. I want to see her, but I'm not necessarily willing to give all of these things up for it. And obviously denying that he even has it in the first place, because that's one thing about Bruno Manheim. Out of all of these things throughout the years, it's very, very hard to prove. After all of this, Superman and John Henry are butting heads a little bit this episode because, of course, he wants Bruno to be able to see Pia. Maybe, that way they can get Bruno to cooperate a bit more. But John Henry's like, not until he meets our demands. They're both murderers. Stop letting your emotions get involved in this because of what's happening with Lois. And to be fair, I did feel like this was quite Superman behavior, as even Lois says later. He is very compassionate. He does have a lot of empathy. That doesn't mean that his emotions are clouding his judgment. It's just very Superman. Meanwhile, with Natalie, she wants to talk to Mateo because she's more leaning on the side that he didn't know about what his mom and dad were up to. And this is where Jonathan somewhat gives her some advice and pisses her off a little bit. But either way, speaking of that, later on, they do turn it around and Jonathan actually suggested meeting up with Mateo. And speaking of Mateo, we do get a scene between him and Bruno fairly early on, and he's just like, I want to see Mum. And he eventually even asks Bruno, saying, have you killed anyone before? And Bruno's like, how could you even ask me that? So he's obviously lying to Mateo. He doesn't want to expose him to actually how much of a crime boss he is. It's kind of a weird thing. He knows a lot more about his father, but not truly the extent. And it's also interesting when you pair that with how Bruno Manheim shows in Bizarro a little bit later. It seems that Mateo is coming into the world a little bit more, but what interests me is he going to kind of put aside the more he learns about his father for the sake of how this could actually end up saving his mother. Meanwhile, with Lois, she's going through her clothes to donate, and she sees the old red dress that Clark brought her, which sends us into that flashback once again of a younger Clark surprising her with a gift, and that was, of course, the red dress. And man, again, I'm a sucker for things like this. We even learned how Clark sold his baseball card collection. I was like, oh man, no. But yes. But no, I kind of feel bad at the same time. And this red dress, once again, without like diving too much into what we talked about earlier, is obviously quite a thing this episode for Lois and Clark, because she is thinking of, well, may as well donate it, because after I've had the surgery, she might not feel like she's able to wear things like that anymore. Now, at this point, Clark isn't really aware so much of what's going on with Lois, other than he notices something is off. We had seeds of this planted early on in the episode with Clark suggesting getting rid of the bed and bringing her back upstairs into the main bed, and she was like, yeah, sure. And then, obviously, as he tried to get closer to her in this moment, she just obviously wasn't remotely for that. that. So when Clark brings the dress to Lana to donate it, Lana obviously is clocking on immediately about what might be going on here with Lois's confidence. And it's not as though Clark isn't, it's just, as he says himself, he wants to talk to her about it, but it's not his body, and he's just a guy who's never got to go through this, so he doesn't feel like it's his place to bring it up. So he's just trying to be considerate, but it's kind of awkward at the same time because Lois is acting very off, especially with the surgery coming up. So we have Lana go visit Lois this episode. Immediately, she is a bit standoffish with it, which, some people are kind of, going a bit against Lois this season. It's like, oh, she's acting like really like bossy, or like she's acting like this, that, and the other. And I just think that's a very human portrayal with what we've been seeing. And this goes back all the way to when I've heard criticisms with how Lois didn't go immediately to get her chemo early on in the season, and just little things like that. She was avoiding it. But I do feel like all of the, there's been criticisms out there of like, oh, she's being really selfish, or this, that, and the other. And I just think, I get what people are saying, but I feel like they're failing to understand how what we're seeing Lois go through, even her demeanor at times being a bit standoffish, or, then she might open up to being very vulnerable like she did after she was standoffish with Lana in this moment. It's just a very human experience. I don't think they're writing Lois to be a bit of a dick at all. Again, I've seen lots of comments like that, but I just feel like some people are failing to understand the depth of what they're trying to show here. And I don't feel like any of us would be really different. Like, oh yeah, we're dealing with all of these problems that Lois is, and we're just like, oh yeah, hey, come in. Yeah, I'm feeling like this. Like there's multifaceted emotions and layers and mental states to this that, again, some people, as I said earlier, fair enough if you're not so into it because this is maybe like too deep and arguably depressing, as some people say for you. But as for actual criticisms for Lois's character, I don't really agree with some of the ones that I've seen out there. I feel like what they've shown has been a very somewhat natural way of depicting what someone like this would be going through. Because we're all human. We're not all 100%, leveled out all the time. And Lois is no different, especially with what she's dealing with. And then as we come out the other side of it and we see the vulnerability being opened up with conversations with Lana, or with other scenes that we've seen in other episodes early on in the season that people are critiquing Lois's character for, I'm just like, did you want Lois just to be like a one-dimensional kind of, hey, I'm happy all the time character? I don't know. I don't blame her for some of the emotional moments she's had, or whether she's just been a bit somewhat blunt every now and again, because she's going through the ringer like again and again and again, and there's always a somewhat justified reason for it, or it just reflects the reality of a situation like this. But meanwhile, with John Henry, he and Natalie are walking down the street of Smallville, and they see Bruno Mannheim's men get out the car, and he just goes ham at them, like starts beating the living crap out of them. This is when Bruno Mannheim is in his office. Superman arrives, and Superman tried to appeal to how Bruno is feeling. And in this moment, as Superman said to John Henry when he burst in with the DOD, he was about to make a deal. I do wonder if that's the case, because he did say if these items were to return, you promise we'll get to see her. I do wonder if he was actually considering it, because, it's not so much of a different approach to what John Henry was doing. The difference between John Henry and what Superman was proposing wasn't different really at all. It was just the approach, like Superman coming at it with compassion in a very Superman way. But with John Henry, it was just like basically holding leverage, saying, hey, if you do not give me these things, you're not going to see your wife, and she basically dies. So that's only going to inflame the situation. But I'm still wondering, would Bruno Mannheim have really parted with those things if the DOD didn't burst in that moment? And so, of course, after John Henry did this pisses off Bruno Mannheim to the point of where he goes to Henry Miller, says, wake him up, there's something I need him to do. And one thing I do want to know about with regards to when Henry Miller woke up, started fighting Superman, or John Henry before that, obviously, is he programmed or something? I don't really get it. If he's getting woken up again, isn't he sick and tired of being used as a tool and dying and then being reanimated necromancy style? Why does he still follow through with it? I feel like they don't get into that enough. You could say that, I don't know, they haven't explained that he's brainwashed. Maybe they're offering him hey, if you just do this for us, we'll keep you alive next time and get rid of your cancer that you keep dying from. I don't know. It just seems like if I was Henry at this point, Henry Miller, I'd be like, right, screw you guys. I'm running away again because you keep bringing me back. I'm going to die anyway. At least I'm going to run to the edge of a cliff somewhere by the sunny seaside and die in peace. So you guys just can't keep using me. But he keeps following their orders. And so this is when we get that fight. Obviously, when Clark was with Lois and, after talking with Lana and they're talking about bazoombas or whatever, Lois is in a bit of a happier state, but Clark has to rush off because John Henry's suit is damaged. He can die very, very easily. And I'm not going to lie, as much as I found this scene really, really cool, I really love the action in Superman and Lois. Obviously, this isn't to the extent of when we saw Superman versus Henry Miller, like Man of Steel style, go through all the buildings, but it's still really, really cool. But I do argue that without the suit, John Henry should have died when he got launched into the cinema. But they did still give an excuse as to why Henry Miller isn't just snapping him like a freaking insect, because as he said to John Henry, they told me to make you suffer. Now, this is when Superman gets tossed into the sky by Henry Miller. And I do argue, I know he must have been launched with such speed and strength, so that's why he was swirling away and then eventually recovered. But this is Superman. I do feel like he should have, been able to reorient himself a lot quicker than that. But, it is what it is. It is meant to serve time for the Warhammer to arrive to John Henry. And this is when Superman, zoomed in and saw that John Henry was about to deal, I guess, the killing blow. Again, another nitpick. I just felt why is this, last whack with the hammer gonna kill him? How do they know that? Not to mention, I know the Warhammer is like a beast, steel suit and hammer is a big deal. But if Henry Miller can take a punch from Superman, why does that mean that this Warhammer is the one that will deal the killing blow? I know that's entering a bit of nitpick territory, but, either way, let me know what you think about that. But the other thing here is we have Superman say, John, no, because he knows it's going to kill Henry Miller, and he does it. And Superman says, after John Henry, I didn't have a choice. There's always a choice. But look at the playback here. John Henry had no choice. Well, I guess you could say the choice was that Superman is somewhat turning his nose up at here. Let him kill you, because that's what would have happened. Literally, you're seeing it. Or, in self-defense, deal the killing blow with the Warhammer so you do not die. As John Henry said later on to Natalie, I had no choice. I agree with John Henry here. If he didn't do that, we saw Henry Miller, burst into flight mode, and that would have been the moment where he's like, okay, I'm not going to take my time anymore. Superman's here. I'm going to kill you now. He would have died. John Henry would have died if he didn't act in self-defense there. So the whole, there's always a choice. I suppose maybe it can be argued that he could say, oh, you could have whacked Henry Miller at a different angle with the hammer so you don't kill him, but I don't know. I felt like it was pretty cut and dry. What else could John Henry do? I just feel like it's a bit weird for Superman to say that, for the episode to frame it this way, where obviously it's a bit different for Superman, because he could have had that choice. He could have restrained Henry Miller. He's still Superman. So even if he got punched around, he would have that other choice to do different attacks, pull his punches. But John Henry, with no suit on, already being thrown around arguably back broken level, didn't really have much of a choice. If he was Superman, then fair enough. He could have done different things because he can take it. I don't know. Let me know your thoughts on this. Now, as we come to the end of the episode, we have Mateo return home, admitting that he saw Natalie. Bruno's a bit pissed about this. But to cut to the chase here, Bruno says, it's time to show you what I've been working on, and he takes him into the room with Bizarro Superman there. And as we've already been over, he says that this is how I found the cure to save your mum. And you do get the vibes that Mateo isn't really frowning upon this. I still acknowledge that he doesn't have the whole picture, and it's probably more what I'm interested in now is if this is going to cause a bit of clash between him and Natalie, because he might go along with what his dad's doing, because at the end of the day, he doesn't want his mum to die, and so therefore he might condone Bruno's actions from here on out with Bizarro Superman, because it's quite simply the only way to save his mum. But that could turn Mateo down a bit of a different path. Even though they've shown him to be nothing like his dad, I do wonder if this is where they're going with his character, and it would just simply put Natalie and Mateo in complete opposite directions of, I don't know, the ethics of the situation. Now, when Clark flies home, we get another flashback very briefly of another nice Lois and Clark moment. Turns out that Lois didn't even win the award, but again, we have those really nice moments that I haven't spoken about so much in this review of him saying how like beautiful she is, and she asks him to say that again in the car. They talk about the wedding venue being at the Kent farm. How fast can you get this dress off? But this ultimately turns into a very, very nice Lois and Clark moment that I think in of itself, if you just saw this clip floating around on YouTube or Twitter and you don't watch the show, you think, okay, Lois and Clark like going up to fly, that's nice. But it's more everything in this episode that led up to this moment, making it that much more of an impactful Lois and Clark scene. But it ends in like a very, very not to sound cheesy here, but beautiful moment. You know, they get dressed up like they did all of those years ago. Tyler was just, I would say, this is what I mean by the quintessential Lois and Clark vibes here. Even his voice where he's like, Lois Lane, you know, will you fly with me? And obviously terrible impression there, but it's just, I know so many people agree with this. It's such good casting, and I feel like this show is criminally underrated for those who love Lois and Clark, who might not watch this show, but they don't realize how many good moments like this are in the show and how good it actually just depicts Lois Lane and Clark Kent. So he says, Lois Lane, you know, will you fly with me? And they do. She says, I love you, Clark, more than ever. I even like reading into that. It's not like, I love you, Superman. It's Clark Kent to her. Sure, like he's Superman. He's Kryptonian. He's cool for that. But she's in love with Clark Kent. It's just a very romantic moment, a lovely Lois and Clark scene. I don't want to repeat myself too much more. I'm sure many of you got teary-eyed at this just like I did. And that's more or less the end of the episode. So thoroughly enjoyed it. I missed Superman and Lois. You know, I didn't even know that it was going on break last week, but it feels really good to have it back. You know, we're not quite at the end of the season yet, but we're certainly getting there. I mean, after all, this was episode 9, and there's 13 episodes this season. So it seems like Lex, obviously, is coming in right at the end, which makes you think, especially after hearing about this cliffhanger this season ends off on, that Lex could have been propelled up to be the main villain of season 4, which just kind of makes us that much more salty about the fact that Superman and Lois is in danger of truly being cancelled. And will it get picked up on Max after that for maybe one final and 4th season? I don't know, but I really, really hope so. So I'm going to end the video here, guys. I'm going to love you and leave you. Just let me know your thoughts on Superman and Lois Season 3, Episode 9. I read every single comment, so I can't wait to see what you thought about the moments in this episode. Any theories that you have? How is Bizarro going to be the cure to Pia? That's another thing, because sure, you could say it's the blood, but like clearly he's got to like wake up and do something, right? And people have got a lot of theories with what Bizarro Superman could somewhat turn into, because there's been a few clues out there, but I wonder what Bruno Manheim is thinking there. There's all kinds of things, so let me know your thoughts. Other than that, of course, like this video, especially if you got this far. It really helps my channel out. Do consider subscribing for more Superman and Lois reviews. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you Kryptonians in the next video. Goodbye.